You are lying face down in a field of mud, and you cannot get up. Not because you're wounded. Not yet, anyway. You can't get up because you are wearing 60 pounds of steel plate armor. You've just been knocked off your horse, and your body is bent in a direction it was never designed to bend while wearing this much weight. Somewhere behind the narrow slit in your helmet, you can hear boots approaching through the mud, and you have absolutely no way of knowing yet whether they belong to a friend or to the man who is about to end your life. Medieval Europe, sometime between the 11th and 15th centuries. You spent 13 years training for this exact moment. Years of unpaid labor, painful lessons, and a mountain of debt your family is still paying off. You were promised glory. You were promised honor. Nobody mentioned that you'd spend most of your career sweating inside an oven-hot metal suit, sleeping in freezing mud, and worrying more about your family's finances than about the enemy in front of you. This is your life as a knight. One of the most expensive, most physically brutal, and most misunderstood jobs in medieval history. Nobody becomes a knight overnight, and nobody becomes a knight by choice alone. In most of medieval Europe, the path to knighthood began around the age of 7, when boys from landowning or noble families were sent away from their own homes to live and serve in the household of another lord, a practice historians call fosterage, designed specifically to build discipline and loyalty outside the softening influence of your own parents. At this stage, you're known as a page, and despite the fact that you're destined for a title that sounds glamorous, your actual daily life looks nothing like it. You serve meals. You clean weapons and armor that don't belong to you yet. You run errands for adults twice your size. Historical accounts of page training describe long days built around service and observation, watching real knights train, absorbing the rhythms of combat, and courtly behavior years before you're ever handed a real weapon. Around age 14, if you've proven yourself, you're promoted to squire. This is where the training intensifies significantly. You practice with wooden swords and blunted weapons under direct supervision, building the specific muscle memory and endurance that full-plate combat will eventually demand. You also become a knight's personal attendant, responsible for maintaining his weapons, armor, and horses, and dressing him for both tournaments and battle. A genuinely necessary job, since a full suit of articulated plate armor involves dozens of buckles, straps, and fitted pieces that are, quite simply, impossible to put on correctly alone. Squires were frequently brought onto actual battlefields, not to fight, but to support the knights they served, retrieving weapons, tending to horses, and in some documented cases, dragging wounded knights to safety when the fighting turned against them. This means your first real exposure to the brutal reality of medieval combat likely came years before you ever swung a real sword in anger, watching it happen to someone else while being expected to keep functioning under pressure. If you survived roughly 13 years of this training and made it through your late teens and early 20s without a disqualifying injury, debt collapse, or simple failure to meet expectations, you were finally knighted, typically in a ceremony involving a formal oath of loyalty and the symbolic touch of a sword to your shoulder. It's a genuinely significant moment. It's also, historically speaking, the point where your financial problems truly begin. Here's something medieval romance rarely mentions. Knighthood was not a salaried position, and it was staggeringly expensive to maintain. A full suit of well-made plate armor represented an enormous financial investment. Historians estimate the cost could be equivalent to a significant fraction of a knight's entire annual income, sometimes comparable to the price of a modest home in relative terms. And armor alone wasn't enough. A knight needed multiple horses for different purposes: a sturdy pack horse to carry gear, a smaller riding horse for everyday travel, and a specifically trained war horse, known as a destrier, bred and conditioned for combat, which could be dramatically more expensive than an ordinary horse, since these animals required years of specialized training to remain calm and controlled amid the noise and chaos of battle. Add to this the cost of weapons, a squire's wages and equipment, tents, provisions for extended campaigns, and the general upkeep of a household expected to project a certain social status, and the financial burden of knighthood becomes genuinely staggering. This is precisely why most knights were not wandering adventurers, but land-owning members of a local gentry, whose income depended directly on the peasants working that land. Being a knight, in a very real economic sense, meant squeezing enough income out of your own estate, and the people working it, just to afford the privilege of risking your life on someone else's battlefield. Financial pressure could follow you even after you'd earned your armor. Historical records from medieval England and France describe knights facing genuine penalties, fines, or the loss of their status entirely if they failed to maintain the equipment and readiness their rank required, meaning that even after all the training, the pressure to spend never actually stopped. Then there's the armor itself, once you've finally paid for it. A complete suit of plate armor typically weighed somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds, distributed across the body in overlapping, articulated plates designed to allow movement. But movement that was still dramatically more exhausting than fighting unarmored. Mounting a horse in full armor without assistance was, for most knights, simply not possible. Historical and experimental archaeology sources describe the routine use of mounting blocks, ramps, or the direct help of a squire. If you were unhorsed during battle, knocked from your saddle, which happened constantly, you faced a genuinely dangerous problem. Full plate armor, combined with the disorientation of a fall, could make getting back up quickly extremely difficult, and knights who went down and couldn't rise fast enough were significantly more vulnerable to finishing blows from opponents on foot. Combined with a narrow field of vision through a closed helmet's visor slit, and the sheer physical exhaustion of moving in this much weight under a hot sun, simply staying alive on a medieval battlefield required managing a level of physical strain most modern viewers dramatically underestimate. Here's the detail that surprises most people learning real medieval military history for the first time. Disease and infection, not enemy blades, were responsible for a substantial share of deaths among medieval soldiers, knights included. Medical understanding at the time had no concept of germ theory. A relatively minor wound, a shallow cut that, today, would be cleaned and bandaged in minutes, could become seriously infected within days, and medieval treatments for infection were, by modern standards, both painful and largely ineffective. Historical medical texts from the period describe treatments including bloodletting and the direct application of heated oil or cauterizing irons to wounds, intended to seal them against infection, a process that added significant additional trauma without addressing the actual bacterial cause of the problem, since that cause simply wasn't understood yet. Beyond individual wounds, medieval military campaigns exposed soldiers to broader health risks that had nothing to do with combat skill at all. Extended marches meant sleeping outdoors in poor weather for days or weeks at a time. Food supplies on campaign were frequently limited to preserved, low-quality rations, hard bread, salted or spoiling meat, and contaminated water sources spread dysentery and other gastrointestinal illnesses rapidly through army camps. Historians studying medieval and early modern warfare have repeatedly noted that disease, not battlefield injury, was often the single largest cause of death in extended military campaigns, a pattern that continued in European armies for centuries after the age of knighthood itself had ended. Combat itself carried its own specific dangers that plate armor could only partially offset. Well-made plate could deflect many sword strikes, and even some arrows, but armorers and their enemies both understood the armor's weak points. The joints at the armpit, the inside of the elbow, the back of the knee, and combat techniques of the era specifically targeted these narrow gaps. Falling from a wounded or dying horse presented another serious risk. Contemporary accounts describe knights becoming trapped or pinned beneath their own collapsing mounts during the chaos of battle, a vulnerable position from which recovery could be genuinely difficult, particularly while wearing dozens of pounds of restrictive armor. There was, however, one financial incentive that shaped knightly combat in a way modern audiences often find surprising: ransom. A captured knight from a wealthy or noble family represented significant potential income, since his family or lord could be expected to pay a substantial sum for his safe return. This economic reality meant that capturing an enemy knight was frequently more valuable, and, for the capturing knight, considerably more profitable than killing him outright. And medieval chronicles describe ransom payments that could genuinely transform a knight's financial fortunes overnight. This same system, however, offered little protection to poorer knights or common soldiers, whose capture held no comparable financial value, and whose survival and defeat depended far more heavily on simple chance than on any economic calculation working in their favor. Knights were bound by an idealized code of conduct historians refer to as chivalry, a set of expectations around courage, loyalty, protection of the weak, and honorable conduct in combat, heavily promoted through medieval literature and courtly culture. In practice, however, chivalric ideals functioned more as an aspirational standard than a universally enforced rule, and battlefield reality frequently diverged sharply from it. A knight who insisted on formal, one-on-one honorable combat could still be killed by ranged weapons, ambush tactics, or simple numerical disadvantage, none of which honored any code at all. Beyond the battlefield, knighthood came bundled with an obligation of military service that a knight could not simply decline. Feudal structures across medieval Europe bound knights to their lords through oaths requiring military support when called upon, and refusal carried serious consequences: the loss of land, title, or standing. This meant knights could be, and frequently were, called away from their own homes and estates for extended campaigns, sometimes in conflicts with little direct connection to their own interests, leaving family land and finances to fend for themselves during their absence. The physical toll of this life accumulated over years of service. Old wounds frequently healed imperfectly in an era without modern surgery, physical therapy, or effective pain management, leaving many knights with permanent injuries, chronic pain, or reduced mobility well before what we would today consider old age. And while medieval sources don't use modern psychological terminology, historians examining accounts of soldiers returning from prolonged, brutal campaigns have noted patterns consistent with what we would now recognize as significant psychological trauma, the lasting effects of years spent in violence, loss, and constant physical danger. experienced in a world with no framework or support system to help process any of it. For knights who survived to old age, financial hardship often followed them into retirement. Land management, inheritance disputes, and the sheer accumulated cost of decades of service left many aging knights in considerably more modest circumstances than the shining, wealthy image popular culture tends to project. Far from every knight ended his life a celebrated hero. Most simply grew old, managed what land and resources remained, and were remembered, if at all, within their own immediate family and community rather than in any grand historical record. The knight of popular imagination, gleaming armor, noble duels, unwavering honor, was never entirely fictional. Elements of that ideal genuinely existed, celebrated in medieval literature and aspired to by real people. But it was only ever half the picture. The other half was 13 years of unpaid childhood labor, a financial burden capable of bankrupting an entire family. 60 pounds of armor turning a summer battlefield into a slow-cooking hazard. Infections that killed more reliably than swords did. A code of honor that offered no actual protection once arrows entered the equation. And, for those who survived long enough to grow old, a retirement defined far more by managing debt and old injuries than by celebrated glory. This was your life as a knight, one of medieval Europe's most expensive, most physically demanding, and most misunderstood roles, hidden for centuries behind a suit of shining armor that, in reality, most knights could barely afford in the first place. If any part of this surprised you, let me know in the comments which detail changed how you picture medieval knighthood. And if you want to see what life actually looked like for the people knights like this were sworn to protect, that video is coming next. Subscribe so you don't miss it.